Ani, bonjour, sego, kwe, watcha. Hello, it's Allan Mountford again. This is the second part of a series of videos for the Nishnabek G7 online conference. And once again, I would like to thank them for allowing me to be part of it, and I would like to thank you for listening and participating and learning about FASD, specifically in the education system. Yesterday I talked about FASD, understanding FASD in the classrooms in the school system. Now I know that some people are desperate for specific strategies, and I get that. However, my history tells me in dealing with the schools that if teachers do not have the correct paradigm, if they don't understand that FASD is a brain-based physical disability that requires accommodations, it really doesn't matter what accommodations they have. If they're not applied in the right way, it doesn't happen in the best way for the students in their classrooms. So what I wanted in the original video is to get people to the place of understanding that FASD is indeed a brain-based disability with behavioral symptoms. So now that we understand that, most certainly I would be thrilled to come to your communities and do a one-day workshop on the real specifics of how to deal with FASD, deal with students in the classroom, subject specific and behavior specific. So we could certainly do that, and you can get a hold of me and I would be thrilled to arrange that. Today, or in this video, what I would like to do is talk about how you can sound your voice in the school system, how you can advocate, when can you have your say officially and unofficially to help your kids with FASD. And as with yesterday, there are going to be some things that I'm going to indicate are take-home messages. These are things that are so important that you really need to understand and apply them. So I will tell you this is a take-home message, and you can write it down. So we know that officially between 2 to 3% of the students in the classrooms have FASD, or prenatal alcohol exposure. However, that is a very conservative number, and the researcher who came out with that number indicates that it's really much higher than that. And there's some belief that the percentage is closer to 8 to 10%, and we will realize that when more professionals become aware of FASD and understand FASD, as well as being able to diagnose better, increasing our diagnostic capacity. So we understand that FASD prevalence exceeds that of any other common birth defect, such as Down syndrome, spina bifida, trisomy 18, as well as autism spectrum disorder. And yet the autism, the amount of funding for autism students in this province has been very significant over the years, and the funding for children with FASD has not been there. So one of the major challenges is, especially when you want to have a voice around FASD in the school system, is that you're dealing with teachers who do not understand FASD. There's no formal training for education practitioners in Ontario. A number of years ago, I sent a letter to the deans of every faculty of education in Ontario, saying to them that this is incredibly important. You need to understand this. It has huge ramifications in the classroom. It has huge ramifications for the students. And I didn't receive one response. So I followed up with a phone call about a month later, and I was told by the deans that their curriculum was so full in the teachers' colleges that they did not have time to deal with another issue such as FASD. Then the government changed how the teachers' colleges work, and they made teacher education a 2-year program. And it was my understanding that the second year was to be a focus on students with special needs. The reality is it didn't turn out that way. So out of all of that contact with the teachers' colleges and the faculties of education in Ontario, I only got 2 responses. One was from York University, with whom I was working anyway through a lady called Kelly Kaloran dealing with their special ed training. And the second, which was when we initiated our FASD classroom in Oshawa through the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. We had their teacher candidates involved in research programs with kids with FASD. But other than that, there has been no interest expressed by faculties of education. And to be honest with you, I can understand where they're coming from, in that unless the ministry sees this as a priority, then the faculties of education will not see this as a priority. And the Ministry of Education has made it very clear through their actions that FASD is not a priority. Sophie Koala, a former MPP from the Kingston area, and our former Premier, Kathleen Wynne, introduced Bill 82 just before the COVID strike, and Bill 172. And Bill 172's purpose was to outline to the boards throughout the province what had to happen around teacher education, making teacher education about FASD mandatory. So I would like to ask all of you, in terms of having a voice, the very first thing you can do is get to your local members of provincial parliament and talk to them about Bill 172 and have them support it. Because without that, unless the ministry says to the boards of education throughout the province that this is a priority, then the boards will not see it as such, because the boards will not spend money unless they won't do programs unless there's money attached to it, and no money will come out without a memorandum of understanding from the Ministry of Education. So the very first thing you can do is get to your member of provincial parliament, talk to them about Bill 172, and tell them how important it is. So in terms of having input and having a voice in the classroom, the number one thing that I would hope that each of you is doing for your kids with FASD is that you're in constant contact with the school, that you are talking to the teacher on a regular basis, that you're talking to the special ed resource teacher on a regular basis, and that they understand that there is a flow of communication. For instance, in the morning when your child goes off to school, do you have some communication with the teacher to tell them how the night went and how the morning went? What space is your child in as they come to school? And the same thing at the end of the day, is there an avenue of communication between the teacher and you, so that the teacher can say, here's how things went today, because it takes a village. And only when that village is on the same page for kids with FASD will they be serviced the way that they should be serviced. So yeah, I suppose it's that sort of that informal structure of communication with the school system that you should have on an ongoing basis. Then it becomes a little more formalized. Your input then has different avenues when things start to become identified a little clearer around the challenges for your student. So as you go along, you see that your student may be starting to experience some difficulties. And again, let's look at where those difficulties are. With kids with FASD, we have what I call the hidden characteristics, and those hidden characteristics are things like the memory challenges, the cognitive challenges, the cognitive disconnects, not being able to keep up with with what a teacher is saying in terms of oral instructions. Challenges with connections and generalizing and evaluating, making decisions. All of this is huge for kids with FASD. Difficulty abstracting and predicting what their behavior is going to cause. They have speech and language impairments. They become very tired. They have sensory issues. And if you remember yesterday, we talked about the developmental dysmaturity, that although a child may, or a youth may appear to be 60, or may chronologically be 16 years old, functionally they may be somewhere around 7 or 8 or 9 years old. And then of course, if those brain-based challenges are not addressed, then that's when you get the reactive behavioral characteristics, the fatigue, the shutting down, the insistence, the intransigence, not being able to move from one situation physically or emotionally to another, and the students will shut down. Their self-concept will suffer. They have a low self-esteem, and then they become prime targets for bullying. And then, of course, if as a school system we don't deal with that, then we get those defensive behaviors that we talked about in the original video, the problems at home, the problems in the community, getting in trouble with the judicial system, health problems, and addictions and substance abuse problems. So what input can we have as parents and as caregivers, grandparents, aunts, and uncles? We know that the kids are going to have difficulty in school for all of the reasons that we've talked about so far, as well as the fact that we understand that if a child has had over three or more adverse childhood experiences, they're 6 times more likely to have challenges in school and with health issues. So our kids need their story to be heard. We know that the brain, again, as we talked about in the original video, the brain damage around FASD is pervasive. There's not one particular spot, so you can't medicate or you can't surgically alter things so that everything's going to be okay. And that affects the behavior, it affects the thinking. An aha moment for me came a couple of years ago when Emily Travis and Miles Himmelreich and CJ Lutke presented their full body diagnosis presentation. Because up until then, for me, FASD focus had been the fact that it's brain damage. In hearing those 3 talk about their experiences and the health issues that they had, that was, as I say, an epiphany for me, because what it says is that those children that are in front of us, part of their story is not only the brain damage that has occurred because of prenatal alcohol exposure, but the rest of their body. The rest of their body is aching and hurting and not doing what it's supposed to do. So again, part of the story that we need to impart to the education system is that these kids have health issues. What are the health issues for your youngster? And so we need to assess that. We need to make sure that doctors are involved as well. Remember, it takes a community. So in terms of building the story, we start with recognizing that there's an issue. It may be a behavioral issue. It may be related to social challenges, or it may be an academic issue. When this is identified, then with communication with the parents, this is when we start to escalate the amount of help for the kids. And it can be, at first, it can be quite informal. So at first there's a teacher assessment. The teacher looks at the situation and says, what are the strengths and the needs of this student? starts a student profile and accommodates the student and evaluates how the accommodations work. And then if from that the teacher says, no, there's still a challenge, then they get the special education resource teacher involved, and that's when we start the formal assessments, the formal evaluations, and data collection, and a plan of action is put into place. If with the input of the special education resource teacher, the challenges still exist, then it's time now to involve more people. So the teacher and the special education resource teacher present their observation and assessments to a school team, and the school team may involve the principal, vice principal, involves the special ed resource teacher, the teacher, education assistants, whoever is involved with the student on a daily basis. Once again, more strategies, more accommodations, and more assessment to see how those are working. And I said at this point we now have an action plan, and that action plan is updated with you, the parent or the caregiver, and it should be updated on a very regular basis. But so now we see that the child is still struggling in the school system, still struggling in the classroom. You've had teacher input, you've now had special education resource input, and you've now had school team input. It's now time to say, maybe we need help from the board. So it's at this point that there's a pre-referral consultation, and the family of school special ed team becomes involved. But no identifying information is passed on. There's no name. It's just that here's the situation, and it's now that the special ed team from the board starts to make recommendations and around accommodations, around ways to help the student in the classroom. And then if it is deemed that the student the challenges are severe enough, then the parent is asked to sign a consent for service. And this only occurs after the previous steps, after the teacher assessment, after the special education resource teacher, after the in-school team, and pre-referral. It's then that you are asked for official permission to then gather data. So the special education resource teacher does the appropriate documentation and sends it into the board. It's at this point, and this is important, it's at this point that you now have to sign a form saying that you consent to the services. Then the special education support begins. There's observation, there's assessment, and maybe a decision regarding referring to an identification, placement, and review committee. And I'm going to talk about that one in a second. The important thing to understand here is that what has happened is that from the initial questioning of whether the student is having challenges or not, right up until the board involvement, there's an increase in resources, which include personnel and dollars spent in accommodations. You have throughout the entire process, you have more people involved, and you have more accommodations, and you have more assessment. So if it is determined after that first process that you have had input into, if it's determined that the student needs maybe greater than what can be provided in a regular school setting, then the identification, placement, and review committee becomes a question. And the role of the IPRC is to decide whether or not a student should be identified as exceptional, determine what the category of exceptionality should be, therefore what placement would be best for the student, and then to review that placement every year. So the IPRC has four specific focuses. And here's how it works. So it's determined based on that first process, step number one, it's determined that the student may indeed need more help than the school can provide. That special education resource teacher has now made the referral to the IPRC by gathering all the data, the observations, the assessments. And they give to you, to the parent and caregiver, they give a letter in writing referring. The parent can ask for help, or the principal can initiate the referral. Within 15 days, the principal has to respond to that letter and give the approximate date of the IPRC, and the IPRCs are usually towards the end of the school year, so they can prepare for the next year. And they would include what's called the Parent's Guide to the IPRC, which tells you, the parent, what your rights and your responsibilities are, and it outlines the timelines of the identification, placement, and review committee meetings. Then there are assessments, and these are psychological, health assessments, but again, what's important here is that parental permission is needed for each of these. If they do a psychoeducational assessment, no parental permission is needed, and that's where they do a series of assessments, and they come up with specific educational recommendations. When you get into the psychological assessments and health assessments, a little more invasive, and that's why they need your permission to do that. So then there's written notice 10 days prior to the IPRC. The parent receives a written notice, the parent or the caregiver, or if the child is over 16, they get the invitation, and it tells specifically the date, time, and place of the IPRC. And they will request that you reply to that. You let them know whether or not you are going to attend. Now, take-home message here. When you go to the IPRC meeting, you can take someone with you. You can take a representative or an advocate. So if you're talking about FASD specifically, you want someone who understands FASD and the school system so that they can provide more information, more, quote, to the story of the student. I go to actually several IPRCs with this exact role in mind. Then comes the IPRC day. So that IPRC committee takes a look at all the information, and the IPRC includes board personnel, it includes school personnel, it includes the parents or caregivers, and whatever specialists they've brought along with them. So they take a look at all the information, and they make a decision as to whether the student is exceptional or not. Do the needs of the student surpass what the regular school system is able to provide? And if so, they need to define what the exceptionality is, and come up with a list of the strengths and needs, and based on those strengths and needs, come up with a placement. And we'll talk about the specific placements in a minute. Here's the challenge for you, and something you need to know. Again, a take-home message. Despite whatever your input is, the IPRC committee has the right to a final decision to say whether or not your child qualifies for special education services. That's why you need to be organized. That's why you need to have constant communication with the school, and become especially vocal during that first part of the process before the IPRC, and then during the IPRC when they are doing all their assessments. Make sure that you are able to say what you need to say. And on that IPRC day, then in most cases, as you walk out of the meeting, there's a written statement. It's either given to you in person or it's mailed to you. And you have to, as a caregiver, you have to agree or not agree to the decision of the IPRC, and you return that within 30 days. So here's how it goes. So there's an IPRC decision, and let's say the IPRC says no, that your son or daughter does not qualify for special education placement. So you can request a second meeting within 15 days. And you can appeal the second decision within 15 days to the secretary of the school board. So you have to send the request to the school board directly, not the school. If you don't request the second meeting or appeal the decision, then the IPRC decision will be implemented within 30 days. No services. If, however, it is agreed based on your input, based on the assessments and the evaluations, that the student is going to be exceptional, remember at this point they will have determined what the exceptionality is and what the placement is to be, the principal then notifies the school that's delivering those education services, and they begin step 3 of your input, which is the individual education plan. And then by law, they have to review this every year. You can waive that review. Do not waive the review. You want to be part of the process all the way along. And you can request a meeting at any time after 3 months, after the IEP is put into place. You have an opportunity to have input again after 3 months and say, we want to take a look at this and have a review. There are 5 exceptionalities in the province of Ontario. The first is behavioral. And behavioral designation is given when the behaviors over time are to such a marked degree and of such a nature that they affect educational performance. So an inability to maintain or to make interpersonal relationships, excessive fears and anxieties, compulsive reaction, inability to learn, and that isn't tied in with intellectual, sensory, or other health factors. And then there's communication, and communication gets a little bit complex, but it's a severe learning disorder characterized by disturbance in the rate of educational development, the ability to relate to the environment around them, perception, speech, and language, and lack of representational symbolic meaning. So what it means, bottom line, is that the information coming from the world around them is severely affected. And then the second is deaf and hard of hearing, which is an impairment characterized by deficits in language, speech development due to auditory response to sound, diminished auditory response to sound. Then there's the language impairment, and language impairment is characterized by an impairment in comprehension and use of verbal communication or written or symbolic system of communication. So kids with FASD often have challenges with information going in, whether it be written or symbolic, whether it be verbal or oral. Their ears may hear what's being said, but the processing between the ears and the brain is all disturbed, and then they have problems processing and formulating an appropriate response, and then they have difficulty often in responding, either verbally or in writing. So their language is their communication for many kids with FASD is severely affected. Now, that may be associated with neurological, psychological, physical, or sensory factors. Then there's speech impairment, which is a disorder in language formulation, which may be associated with neurological, psychological, physical, or sensory factors. And that involves perceptual motor aspects of transmitting oral messages. Often affects the rhythm of how they speak, the stress on words. They have difficulty in expressing themselves. Then there's a learning disability, and the learning disability is evident in both academic and social situations, and involves one or more of the processes necessary for proper use of spoken language and symbolic language. So it has nothing to do with vision and hearing and physical development or emotional or cultural situations. It's a discrepancy between academic performance and assessed intellectual abilities. So a true learning disability, the student can't do something, but their intellect says that they should be able to do it. So there's a deficit between their academic performance and what they're supposed to be able to do in receptive language, language processing, expressive language, or they can also have a mathematical learning disability due to math complications. Then there's intellectual. An intellectual exceptionality has three parts to it. The first is giftedness, where the student requires depth and breadth of instruction that's beyond the regular school system. Then there's mild intellectual disability, which is where a student can benefit from a regular classroom with some sort of accommodations. And then there's developmental disability, where it's a severe learning disorder, and where kids can benefit from a specialized special ed environment. And these are the kids with severe limited potential for learning, for independence, and for economic self-support. Then there's a physical disability categorization. The physical disabilities, again, a severe physical limitation that requires assistance in learning situations to bring the student to the same level as other pupils, his same age, and with the same developmental level. And then there's blind and low vision, which deals with students with partial or low or total impairment of sight, which obviously affects their learning. And then the fifth and final categorization of the exceptionalities in Ontario is the multiple exceptionality designation. And it's a combination of learning or other disorders, impairments, physical disabilities of such a nature that it requires educational services of one or more teachers that are specially trained in special education and provision of support services appropriate for whatever the disorders that the student has. So we have the five designations of disabilities in Ontario: behavioral, communication, intellectual, physical, and multiple. And it's up to the Iprc to determine which of those your child has. So then the other function, one of the other functions that I mentioned of the Iprc is then once they've designated the categorization of exceptionality, it's up to them then to determine where the student is going to be placed within the school system to get the maximum help. And again, similar to the behavioral characteristics, similar to the information and assessment process, there's a continuum here. So it starts off with the student staying in a regular class with indirect support. So they stay in the classroom and the teacher goes to the special ed resource teacher or to other resources to see if the teacher themselves can come up with solutions and accommodations for the student. If that's not possible, then the next is regular class with resource assistance. So once again, the student stays in the regular class, but then the special ed resource teacher comes in to observe and to assess and to work with the student right within the classroom. So in those first two, the student stays within the classroom the entire time. Then there's regular class with withdrawal support. So they stay in the regular classroom except for a certain amount of time during the day where they go out for special education intervention. But that special education intervention has to be less than 50% of the day. And then there's special education class with partial integration, which sort of flips that other one upside down. And it says that the student will be in the special education setting for at least 50% of the day, but then they may have part of their day integrating back into the regular classroom. And in many cases, it's hoped that the student will be able to go back to the regular classroom and to be able to function. Excuse me. But there's an issue here that I want to address with that. We have a habit in the education field of wanting kids to do so well and to become so normalized that we provide accommodations for them, and when they do well with those accommodations, we then put them in a situation where the accommodations are taken away. And it's at this stage that we can start to see this happening, and we have to be aware of it. When they're going from a special education setting to an integrated setting, we've often got to make sure that the help, the support is still there for the students, because it falls apart. So if you remember back to the first video, I talked about the goal with these students to be interdependence versus independence. Let's not assume that every kid with FASD is going to be able to get out there and be independent for the rest of their school career or their work career or in their social life, because they may not be able to do that. So they need support. They need that interdependence throughout their entire environment and their entire life situation. And the final category is full-time special education class, and these are the students who need a student-teacher ratio that conforms to specific regulations set out in the Ministry of Education. These are the kids that will not function in a regular classroom. So again, 5 specific spots where the students can go once they've been identified as an exceptional pupil. One is regular class, where the teacher goes and tries to find some resources that help. The second is in the regular classroom, but with the input of the special education resource teacher. The third is the regular classroom, but with some sort of withdrawal support for special education, and that withdrawal is less than 50% of the day. And then the fourth is a special education class with partial integration. So they are in the special education class, and they are out for less than 50% of the day. And then final is the full-time segregated program. So the third place where you have a voice is in the education plan, the individual education plan, or the IEP. And the IEP is a legal document. It's to be followed. It is set out by the Iprc, the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee, and the IEP is based on the categorization of what the Iprc determined your student needs in terms of help. So it's a legal document, has to be followed, must include the specific expectations for your pupil, an outline of the special education program, and specific statement of the methods that are to be used. Also a transition plan. Remember, I said that the student's story doesn't end with you. You have to have input into the next chapter of that student's life when they go from you to the next stage. So there will be a transition plan from kindergarten to primary junior, primary, junior to the intermediate, and from intermediate into the senior or secondary school, and then equally important into post-secondary, whether it's post-secondary education, which now is a very real thing for people with FASD. Didn't used to be, but with appropriate supports, these kids are doing awesome in the college and university programs. Or if they go into the workplace, there has to be a transition so that wherever they go, their strengths and challenges are known. So an IPRC or an IEP is not a description of everything that's going to be taught to the student. It is not a list of teaching strategies used in a regular classroom instruction. It is not a document that records all learning expectations. And it's not a daily lesson plan for the teachers. What it is, it's a written plan describing the special education program and services that your child deserves, looking at their strengths and needs. It's a record of particular accommodations. I'm going to speak to accommodations in a minute. There's a difference between accommodations and modifications. It's a working document, and that's important. It's a working document. The teacher needs to have access to this and know in the classroom what the IEP says so that they can do their daily programming based on this. It identifies the learning expectations that are modified from the regular expectations of other kids in that particular grade and age level. It's a working document that identifies all alternative expectations if required. It's a record of specific knowledge and skills to be assessed and evaluated for the purpose of reporting student achievement, which is by law necessary, and also gives a record of achievement of the modifications and the alternative expectations. And it's an accountability tool for the student, for the teachers, and for the parents, so that everybody understands there's a responsibility for this child and that this is the official plan for this child. Lots of information to be included in the IPRC, and the special education resource teacher makes sure that all of that is included. It includes relevant assessment data. It includes list of subjects and courses, accommodations, modifications, level of achievement in each modified course so that you can measure how they've done over the period of time. Annual program goals, assessment methods, clear indication of the resources that the teachers are going to use. So usually in the schools, it will be the special education resource teacher and or the vice principal that does the IEP. And the first thing, and there are 5 steps. The first is to gather information. They take a look at the student's records, including the IPRC statement of decision and the previous IEPs and the Ontario student record. Consult with the student, the school staff, other professionals, and more importantly, consult with the parents and gather information through observation and through official assessments. Stage 2 is then to set the direction. A collaborative approach, of course, an IEP team. Who is involved in making sure that this IEP is followed, and begin work on the IEP. Indicate the student's areas of strengths and the areas of weakness, because that's what the program is going to be based on. And then you develop the IEP as it relates to the student's special education program and services. So it identifies, it classifies the course. Is the student taking standard course, or are they in the academic stream? Record decisions about programs exemptions. Does the student have such a language challenge that the mandatory French instruction would be just even more frustrating for the student? In which case, then we can have subjects put in place of the French and it's what we call a French exemption. So there are all sorts of things within the IEP that are very prescriptive as to what has to happen. You as a parent need to know what these things are. Then there's a review and update of the IEP at the beginning of each reporting period. So each report card that comes home, there should be an update of the IEP. Review the IEP regularly and you record what revisions there are. The IEP has to be stored in the Ontario Student Record, and any transition plans are attached to the IEP. So once all that is done, then you implement it. Then the teacher now takes a look at all of that information and says, here's what I'm going to do to make this a successful school year for the student in my classroom. So a lot of all of that is recorded in the actual report card, and then based on the success of the student or the challenges of the student, then the IEP can be revised. So within the IEP, what should be included are reports that support the identification, a brief summary of each of the report's findings, any medical diagnoses that support the identification of the exceptionality, and if desired, current achievement and grade equivalent scores. Although it's my understanding and my history that we're starting to move away from specific scores being put in the IEPs. What not to include: every report that has ever been done on the student. Numerical scores or percentiles, and this is what I was talking about when they're saying current achievement and grade equivalent scores. That has to do with academics, but when you get into numerical scores and percentiles, then you're into things like IQ, and that we do not want to have. You don't want to have medical diagnoses that don't relate to the identification of the student's exceptionality. You don't want personal or family information such as court orders and whatever, and you don't want achievement or grade equivalent scores from 3-4 years ago. They have to be current. You can ask to see that Ontario student record, and that's important. Take a look at that, because you'll see what is floating from year to year about your child in the school system. And I'll tell you, I've seen a lot of Ontario student records that contain very many of the things that I just said that should not be included. And I feel very awkward in taking a look at some of the personal information that comes up. So in terms of classifying the courses, and this has to do with secondary students, in planning the IEP, we need to know what is happening to the student in terms of needs so that we can give them the correct courses. So if a student needs no accommodations or modifications, then usually they would not have an IEP, but that's not 100% of the time. There are students who do not have accommodations or modifications, but because of being, quote, at risk, they may need an IEP. In some cases, students will be accommodated only, and that's where they go into that group of students that is usually in the regular classroom with some sort of special ed support. Then there's modified, and modified courses are where the student is unable to function in the regular school curriculum. They may be 2 or 3 years behind. They then have a modified curriculum. Now, students can have a combination of both accommodated and modified courses. And then there's alternative, alternative, and in the secondary schools, these are what we call K courses, where the students are not going to probably have a very sophisticated post-secondary experience. These are often the kids with pretty severe challenges. So, in summary then, you as a parent or as a caregiver have 3 main times that you can have your voice heard. The first is informally, ongoing, day after day after day. Have conversation with your teachers. And I'll tell you, a Tim's card, $10 Tim's card, once a month or once a semester, does wonders with saying thank you to the teachers, because they are working hard, as are you. But you need that relationship with the teachers and with the education system. The second then becomes the Iprc process, when with all of the conversation between you and the teacher and the resource teacher, they're saying your child needs just a little bit more. Then you talk about taking it to the second step, which is the identification, placement, and review committee process, where more people become involved, more decisions are made around accommodations, and there are more assessments. And then if they determine that your child is exceptional, they will determine one of the 5 exceptionalities, and then they will determine one of the 5 placements based on that exceptionality. And then finally they will make an IEP. And that's the third part, where you have your input, is developing the IEP so that the appropriate stuff is put into place for your student. And then the final thing that this is a take-home message that I can't stress enough, is this transition from one situation to another. So transition planning can involve teachers, principals, school board officials, families, healthcare workers, community workers. There's a whole slew of people that should be involved here, because once again, it takes a community, and it's you're sending that kid out of the school system into that community. Transition plan identifies goals for work, further education, community living, and they should reflect actual opportunities and resources in your area. They should be achievable by the student, given appropriate supports. They should define the actions that are necessary year to year to help the student achieve his or her goals, and finally clarify the roles and responsibilities of the student, the family, and everyone else that's in that support network. So a transition plan is incredibly important. Because remember, and I'm gonna remind us of the take-home message from the first video, that although these students they are chronologically older, they may be functionally half of that age. So you can assume that a child with FASD is functioning at half their age. Would you ask an 8-year-old to do what you're asking that 16-year-old? Ask yourself that question, and it will help you decide whether or not you want to proceed. Because part of the story is that these kids have a brain-based invisible disability that has behavioral symptoms, and we need to accommodate based on their reality, not our reality. So what really needs to change, as we talked about in the first video, is if a person is presenting with fetal alcohol neurobehavioral symptoms, then take a look at the setting. If it's a good fit, everything's going well. If things are not going well, it means it's a poor fit, and we're not obligated or supposed to want to change the child. It's us that has to change. We have to change the way we do things. We have to be the executive assistants for these students. We need to ask that question, who is this person in front of me, so that we can develop a story and the next chapters that are relevant for this student. Going to include some resources about the IEP. I invite you to take a look at those, and it will also include a couple of resources in terms of accommodations. So thank you very much. This is the second of 3. I have one more relatively short video that deals with sort of the First Nations way of looking at education, and to speak sort of about COVID and what we're doing with that in the school system at this point. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Bamapi.